You vote every few years and feel like you're participating in democracy. But what if voting is actually designed to make you feel powerful while keeping you powerless? Everyone knows the democratic process. You research candidates, choose between competing parties, cast your ballot, and expect the winner to implement their promised policies. Why do the same fundamental policies continue regardless of which party wins elections? This sounds like democracy because we see different candidates campaigning on different platforms and assume that electoral victories translate into policy changes. But there's something that doesn't add up about why military spending never decreases, why financial regulations never meaningfully constrain banks, and why wealth inequality accelerates under both conservative and progressive governments. The democracy illusion works by creating the appearance of choice while ensuring that all viable options serve the same underlying interests. While voters engage in horizontal competition between left and right, elites maintain vertical coordination that transcends party boundaries. If this kind of political theater disguised as democratic participation interests you, subscribe to Prof. Jong Explained and share this video with someone who's been wondering why their vote never seems to change anything fundamental. They need to understand how the democracy game actually works. The system creates two completely different levels of political engagement. When we talk about democracy, we mean fundamentally different games depending on whether you're a voter or a policy influencer. For voters, democracy means choosing between candidates who represent different ideological positions and competing visions for society. You're told that elections determine policy direction and that your vote influences government decisions. For policy influencers, democracy means managing public opinion while ensuring that core interests remain protected regardless of electoral outcomes. They understand that elections are about coalition management rather than policy determination. Think about the last major election in your country. Which fundamental economic structures actually changed after the new government took office? This explains something curious about political campaigns. Candidates spend enormous resources competing for votes while maintaining remarkably similar positions on issues that affect the most powerful interests in society. The difference isn't about ideology or party affiliation. It creates systematically different relationships with political power, where some people think they're choosing policy direction, while others are actually determining policy boundaries. But here's where it gets interesting. The democracy illusion doesn't just disguise elite control. It actually requires active voter participation to maintain legitimacy while ensuring that participation never threatens core interests. Consider how electoral systems channel political energy. Voters are encouraged to focus on candidate personalities, cultural issues, and ideological differences that don't affect fundamental power structures. This creates what political scientists call issue displacement, where public attention gets directed toward debates that feel important but don't threaten established interests. Meanwhile, the most consequential policy decisions often happen through regulatory agencies, international agreements, and bureaucratic processes that operate independently of electoral outcomes. The displacement mechanism ensures that democratic energy gets absorbed by symbolic conflicts, while structural policies continue unchanged regardless of which party controls government. The issue displacement becomes particularly sophisticated through what we might call the culture war diversion. Social and cultural issues become the primary battleground for political competition, while economic and structural policies remain remarkably consistent across different administrations. This cultural focus creates intense emotional investment in electoral outcomes while ensuring that the most consequential economic policies operate outside the realm of democratic debate. Voters become deeply engaged in battles over social issues that feel meaningful but have little impact on power structures, while the policies that actually determine economic outcomes receive minimal electoral attention. But the democracy illusion becomes even more sophisticated when we examine how it handles the relationship between campaign promises and governing reality. Candidates make extensive promises during campaigns, creating the impression that elections determine policy agendas. But governing requires working within existing institutional constraints that severely limit policy options. These institutional constraints include everything from central bank independence to international trade agreements to regulatory capture by industry interests. When new governments discover they cannot implement their promised changes due to these constraints, the failure gets attributed to political opposition or practical difficulties rather than structural limitations on democratic control. This creates what we might call the implementation gap, where voters believe they're choosing policy directions while actually choosing which coalition will manage predetermined policy boundaries. The implementation gap becomes particularly visible during moments of supposed political change. New administrations often discover that campaign promises cannot be fulfilled due to institutional realities that were never discussed during the electoral process. These institutional realities include bureaucratic resistance, judicial constraints, international agreements, and financial market pressures that operate independently of electoral mandates. The discovery that democratic mandates cannot overcome institutional constraints creates disillusionment among supporters, while reinforcing the system's stability through demonstrating the limits of electoral influence. Do you notice how different parties often end up implementing similar policies despite campaigning on opposite platforms? The democracy illusion also exploits what game theorists call the coordination problem. Voters face collective action challenges that make effective political organization difficult, while elites face coordination advantages that make policy influence relatively easy. Individual voters have limited time, information, and resources to dedicate to political engagement. Even when they organize into groups, they must compete for attention with countless other groups advocating for different priorities. Meanwhile, concentrated interests have strong incentives to invest heavily in political influence because the returns are enormous and the costs can be shared among relatively few actors. This asymmetric coordination creates what economists call rational ignorance among voters and rational engagement among elites, leading to systematically unequal political influence. The coordination asymmetry also manifests through what political scientists call the collective action dilemma. Individual voters have little incentive to become deeply informed about complex policy issues because their single vote is unlikely to influence outcomes. But concentrated interests have enormous incentives to become deeply informed and actively engaged because policy outcomes can significantly affect their wealth and power. This creates knowledge gaps, where the people most affected by policies have the least influence over them, while the people with the most influence often have interests that conflict with broader public welfare. But there's something even more insidious about how the democracy illusion handles political information and narrative control. Voters receive political information through media systems that are owned by the same interests that benefit from policy capture. This creates information asymmetries that favor elite narratives while limiting voter understanding of how political systems actually work. The information asymmetry doesn't require direct censorship or conspiracy. It operates through agenda setting, framing effects, and the natural tendency for media organizations to avoid challenging the interests of their owners and advertisers. This creates what media scholars call manufactured consent, where public opinion appears to emerge organically while actually being shaped by systematic information management. The consent manufacturing process ensures that voters make free choices within boundaries that serve elite interests, maintaining democratic legitimacy while preventing democratic control. The manufactured consent operates through subtle mechanisms that shape political discourse without appearing manipulative. Stories that challenge established interests receive less coverage, while stories that reinforce existing power structures receive extensive attention. This coverage bias doesn't require explicit coordination among media organizations. It emerges naturally from the incentive structures and ownership patterns that characterize modern media systems. The result is that voters receive information that appears diverse and independent, while actually being constrained within narratives that serve concentrated interests. Can you think of any major policy area where public opinion polling consistently shows majority support for changes that never get implemented? The democracy illusion also creates what political scientists call the legitimacy trap. The more people participate in elections, the more legitimate the political system appears, even when electoral participation doesn't translate into policy influence. High voter turnout gets interpreted as evidence of democratic health rather than recognition that people feel compelled to participate in a system they cannot actually control. This participation paradox allows democratic governments to claim popular mandates for policies that often contradict majority preferences, because the election itself demonstrates public acceptance of the system. The legitimacy trap becomes particularly powerful during periods of political polarization, when increased electoral engagement actually strengthens the system by channeling dissatisfaction into partisan competition rather than structural criticism. The legitimacy trap also operates through what we might call the participation obligation. Citizens are taught that voting is their civic duty and that non-participation undermines democracy. This obligation creates psychological pressure to participate in elections, even when the available choices don't represent voter preferences, or when electoral outcomes have little impact on policy direction. The participate obligation ensures that democratic legitimacy gets maintained, even when democratic influence is minimal, because the act of participation itself is interpreted as consent to the system. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the democracy illusion is how it handles the relationship between electoral competition and policy coordination. Different parties compete intensely for votes while cooperating extensively on policies that serve concentrated interests. This competition-cooperating dynamic creates the appearance of conflict while maintaining underlying consensus. The electoral competition focuses on issues where parties can differentiate themselves without threatening established interests, such as cultural issues, government spending priorities, and regulatory approaches that don't affect fundamental power structures. Meanwhile, policy coordination happens through informal networks, revolving door relationships between government and industry, and bipartisan cooperation on issues that receive little public attention. This creates what we might call competitive theater, where intense public competition disguises extensive private cooperation on the issues that matter most to policy outcomes. The competitive theater becomes particularly visible in areas like foreign policy, financial regulation, and trade policy, where supposed partisan opponents often support remarkably similar positions that serve concentrated interests. This policy convergence happens despite heated electoral competition, because the real constraints on policy come from institutional and economic pressures rather than ideological differences between parties. The theater of competition distracts attention from the reality of coordination, ensuring that voters focus on symbolic battles while missing substantive policy cooperation that affects their lives. The democracy illusion also exploits temporal displacement, where the long-term consequences of policy decisions become separated from the electoral cycles that supposedly control policy direction. Most significant policy changes take years or decades to fully implement and show results, while election cycles typically last 2 to 6 years. This timing mismatch allows politicians to make promises they cannot fulfill and avoid responsibility for policies implemented by previous administrations. The temporal displacement creates accountability gaps where voters cannot effectively reward or punish politicians for policy outcomes because the causal connections are unclear and delayed. This timing problem ensures that electoral competition focuses on symbolic issues and short-term concerns rather than the long-term structural policies that most affect people's lives. The temporal displacement also creates what political scientists call the electoral cycle paradox. Politicians have incentives to implement popular policies immediately before elections, while implementing unpopular but structurally necessary policies immediately after elections. This timing strategy allows politicians to maintain electoral support while implementing policies that serve concentrated interests during periods when electoral accountability is minimal. The cycle manipulation ensures that voters experience the benefits of popular policies during election periods while experiencing the costs of structural policies during non-electoral periods, creating systematic biases in democratic accountability. Have you ever wondered why long-term problems like infrastructure decay, environmental degradation, or wealth inequality persist despite decades of elections promising to address them? The democracy illusion becomes particularly effective when it intersects with what behavioral economists call loss aversion in political psychology. Voters tend to focus on preventing losses from political opponents rather than achieving gains from preferred candidates. This defensive psychology makes people more likely to vote against candidates they dislike than for candidates they enthusiastically support. The loss aversion dynamic gets exploited through negative campaigning and fear-based messaging that makes elections feel like existential battles between good and evil rather than choices between policy alternatives. This psychological manipulation ensures that voters remain highly engaged in electoral competition while becoming less focused on policy evaluation and governmental accountability. The loss aversion also creates what psychologists call the lesser evil trap, where voters consistently choose candidates they don't really support in order to prevent candidates they actively oppose from winning. This lesser evil dynamic ensures that electoral competition operates within narrow boundaries that exclude options that might threaten established interests while maintaining the appearance of meaningful choice. But there's yet another dimension that makes the democracy illusion particularly effective at maintaining elite control while preserving democratic legitimacy. The system creates what political scientists call pluralist capture, where multiple competing elite groups share policy influence rather than any single group dominating completely. This pluralist arrangement allows different elite interests to take turns influencing policy in their preferred directions while ensuring that no single election or party can threaten the overall structure of elite influence. The rotation of influence creates the appearance of democratic responsiveness while maintaining structural constraints on policy options that might threaten concentrated interests. The pluralist capture also operates through what scholars call policy network management, where different elite groups coordinate their influence activities to ensure that their interests are protected regardless of electoral outcomes. These networks include formal lobbying organizations, informal social connections, revolving door relationships between government and industry, and coordination through elite educational institutions and social organizations. The network management ensures that elite interests receive representation and protection that transcends partisan political competition while maintaining the appearance of competitive democracy. Consider how the democracy illusion handles international policy coordination. National governments often claim that their policy choices are constrained by international agreements, global market forces, or diplomatic necessities. These international constraints provide convenient explanations for why democratically elected governments cannot implement policies that might have domestic support, but would threaten international elite interests. The globalization of elite coordination creates what scholars call post-democratic governance, where policy decisions increasingly happen through international institutions that are insulated from democratic pressure. This international dimension allows domestic politicians to blame external forces for unpopular policies while actually cooperating in global policy coordination that serves transnational elite interests. The international coordination also creates what political economists call the globalization constraint, where national governments claim they cannot implement policies that might reduce their competitiveness in global markets. This constraint narrative allows governments to avoid implementing policies that might redistribute wealth or constrain business interests by claiming that such policies would harm national economic performance in global competition. The globalization constraint operates regardless of whether alternative policies would actually harm economic performance, because the constraint serves as a convenient justification for avoiding policies that threaten concentrated interests. The democracy illusion also creates what we might call the reform trap, where demands for political change get channeled into modifications that strengthen the system rather than challenges that might transform it. When voters become dissatisfied with political outcomes, they typically demand reforms like campaign finance changes, ethics rules, or procedural modifications that address symptoms rather than causes of democratic dysfunction. These reforms often make the system appear more responsive, while actually creating new mechanisms for elite influence and policy capture. The reform process becomes a way to release political pressure while preserving fundamental power relationships, ensuring that democratic dissatisfaction strengthens rather than threatens the democracy illusion. The reform trap also operates through what political scientists call the institutional complexity defense. The more complex political institutions become, the more opportunities exist for sophisticated actors to influence outcomes while maintaining the appearance of democratic process. Campaign finance reforms, ethics requirements, and procedural rules often create additional layers of complexity that favor actors with resources and expertise, while making it more difficult for ordinary citizens to understand or influence political processes. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the democracy illusion is how it has convinced people that political participation equals political power, even when extensive evidence suggests otherwise. When millions of people vote in elections, lobby their representatives, and engage in political activism without seeing corresponding policy changes, the system encourages them to blame insufficient participation rather than structural limitations on democratic influence. This participation attribution error keeps people engaged in political activities that feel meaningful while directing energy away from analysis or action that might actually threaten elite policy control. The illusion works because it provides psychological satisfaction of political engagement while ensuring that engagement serves system maintenance rather than system change. This illusion of agency prevents people from recognizing that their political activities might be serving different purposes than they intend. Have you ever noticed how the people most engaged in electoral politics often seem most frustrated with political outcomes while remaining convinced that more engagement is the solution? The democracy illusion ultimately works because it offers an appealing narrative about political agency while operating through mechanisms that ensure elite policy control, regardless of democratic participation. The democracy game continues because it serves essential functions for both elites and masses, providing elites with legitimate authority while providing masses with meaningful participation experiences. Hit subscribe if you want more analysis of how political systems that appear to serve public participation actually serve elite coordination, and share this with someone who's been voting for change, but wondering why fundamental policies never seem to change regardless of election results.